Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Ichon. This podcast is a recorded lecture by the Honorable Janice Rogers Brown, former judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit and a former Associate Justice of the California Supreme Court. Judge Brown, who was the keynote speaker at PRI's second annual policy conference in Sacramento, discusses the current risk to our Constitution and the foundations of American democracy due to cultural trends such as identity politics, political correctness, and speech codes. Thanks for listening to Judge Brown's important message.
We'd like to now begin our luncheon program. To introduce our keynote speaker, the Honorable Judge Janice Rogers Brown, I'd like to introduce our board member, the Honorable Daniel Kolke. Dan is a PRI board member, as I mentioned, and chair of PRI's California Reform Committee. He's been a partner at the San Francisco office of Gibson Dunn for several years, and he's thinking about retiring. I wonder if they will really let him retire. But if he does retire, he'll have a million other jobs that he will be pursuing. He is chair of the firm's California Appellate Law Practice Group, and he served for 5 years as an associate justice on the California Court of Appeal, 3rd Appellate Division. I'm saying now he needs to go on to the Ninth Circuit. I'm going to nominate him for the Ninth Circuit, even though I have no power. He also served as Legal Affairs Secretary and Counsel to Governor Pete Wilson, and also acted as Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger's lead negotiator for the tribal state compacts. Please welcome to the podium the Honorable Daniel Kolke.
Well, it's my great honor and privilege to introduce Janice Rogers Brown. Janice was born in Alabama, and as she was telling us at the table, she was the daughter of a sharecropper. And from those humble beginnings, she got appointed to the highest court in California and the second most important court of appeals in the United States, which I'll get to in a moment. But Janice has had an extremely distinguished career. She spent a couple years as a deputy legislative counsel for the California Legislative Council. She was a deputy attorney general for the California Department of Justice for 8 years. She was a deputy secretary and general counsel of the California Business Transportation Agency. And then, for a very brief period, Janice and I had parallel lives for just a short moment in history. We both graduated from law school in 1977, Janice from UCLA Law School. Janice, as Sally alluded to, Janice was Legal Affairs Secretary for Governor Pete Wilson from 1991 to 1994, and I succeeded Janice as Legal Affairs Secretary. Janice then was appointed to the California Court of Appeal, 3rd Appellate District, in 1994, and she served there until 2005, and I succeeded her on the California Court of Appeal. And I might note that I use the word succeeded because when Thomas Jefferson was ambassador to France, he had come in just after Benjamin Franklin had left. And the French government said, well, Mr. Jefferson, are you replacing Mr. Franklin? And Jefferson said, no one can replace Dr. Franklin. I am succeeding him. And in the same sense, no one can replace Janice Rogers Brown. I simply succeeded her in a couple positions. And that is where the parallelism ends, because at that point, Janice went on to real glory. She got appointed to the California Supreme Court as an associate justice by Governor Wilson and was confirmed by the Commission on Judicial Appointments and served there with great distinction from 1996 to 2005. And then President George W. Bush nominated, and Janice was confirmed by the U.S. Senate to what really is the second most important court in the United States, which is the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, where again she served with great distinction. But I think to just kind of close this introduction of this incredible trajectory and career of Janice Brown, the best way to appreciate Janice is for me just to note a couple of her quotes and prose that shows her devotion to common sense, free markets, property rights, and free speech, which together is what has made this country the most free and prosperous country in the world. So let me just take a couple quotes I found on the internet from Janice that shows her insights. Quote, "Government is the only enterprise in the world which expands in size when its failures increase." And just think of the Great Recession, which really was greatly caused by government programs that were pushing loans to people who couldn't afford them, that resulted in the whole financial crisis. Janice also has noted, quote, "Where government," and this is very eloquent, "where government moves in, community retreats, civil society disintegrates, and our ability to control our own destiny atrophies." So, with those brilliant words, I introduce and welcome Judge Janice Rogers Brown.
Well, good afternoon. It's wonderful to see you all here. I'm delighted that PRI is now going to have an annual policy summit. I think that's a great thing. I think I should start perhaps with a disclaimer, because I know you're going to talk about economics and free markets and all of that, and I am not an economist. I'm not even a judge anymore. I'm retired. But I'm somebody who has spent a very long time thinking about governance, thinking about the American founding, and thinking about why it worked to create the incredible country that it did. And what now seems to be going awry. So I want to take a little step back here. You will get into the weeds later on, but I'm going to take a step back and talk a little philosophy. In, I think, probably 2000, Steely Dan, which is for those of you who aren't into music, a group, a musical group, released an album which I thought contained a very intriguing song. It was a song about meth addiction, and it contained this haunting line describing a friend named Teddy as, quote, skating backwards at the speed of light. And that always struck me when I heard that. So I was thinking, now in the fable year 2020, we begin to sense that our addictions, as destructive as they are, may be the least of our problems. We are unquestionably moving backwards in our politics. And the velocity is frightening, but I think a better analogy might be moonwalking into madness. For those of you who are too young to have seen MJ in action, I'll tell you that moonwalking is a dance move in which the dancer creates the illusion of moving forward while actually gliding backwards. And that posture, that illusion of progress, when what is really happening is destruction and devolution, seems to me the perfect visual depiction, not only of the direction of American democracy, but the trajectory of Western civilization generally. America became a beacon to the world because of its commitment to freedom. It became a pariah for the same reason. Our foundational text embodied a new idea of political freedom. Henry Jaffa has contended that the American founding limited the ends of government to enhance, quote, the intrinsic possibility of human excellence. The idea that through the great Western canon, from the philosophy of Athens, the revelation of Jerusalem, the Enlightenment in London, to the political society formed in Philadelphia, true goodness could be grasped. Western civilization arguably reached its apogee in Philadelphia in 1776. Consider what the late Leszek Kolakowski posited as probably the most famous single sentence ever written in the Western Hemisphere. He nominated, quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." But as Kolakowski goes on to say, what seems self-evident at the founding would appear either patently false or meaningless and superstitious to those who now think they should be in the business of shaping our political imagination. Why the ancients would dismiss this idea is obvious. They did not think in terms of human equality. But why today's cognitive elite feels compelled to do so is a more intriguing tale. There's a writer by the name of Orestes Brownson. He was a contemporary of Lincoln, actually. And I think he concisely captures what's unique about America. He said, its idea is liberty, indeed, but liberty with law and law with liberty. Its mission, he said, was the realization of the true idea of the state, which secures at once the authority of the public and the freedom of the individual, the sovereignty of the people without social despotism, and individual freedom without anarchy. The American Republic was instituted by Providence to realize the freedom of each with advantage to the other. Now you may ask, why then do we have at least 12 candidates for president, all of whom are espousing socialist ideas? I mean, how did that happen? And I'm going to present a theory of how that came about, because I think people feel a little disoriented when they see how things are. Like, that just doesn't make any sense. You know, how do we have this pack of socialists? So although socialism was never formally adopted in America, the assault on private property, which socialist ideas engendered, largely succeeded. That success depended in large part on a so-called second founding, pursued and implemented by American progressives. Its early objectives were achieved by stealth and sleight of hand. Woodrow Wilson forthrightly argued that the Madisonian equilibrium, the Constitution's architecture of separated powers, federalism, and checks and balances, was, he said, woefully inadequate for handling the tests required by the government of a modern industrial nation. The second founding, which was baldly intended to efface the original founders, was based on the progressives' theory or philosophy of history. For progressives, history is not a mere record of events, but a providential working out of rational ends. At least that's how they describe it. But despite their outsized confidence that the human condition would improve as history marches forward, they also argued that history could and should be pushed along with the help of the benign guidance of disinterested experts. In other words, even though history has this evolutionary potential and everything is going to work out just fine, you need this cadre of bureaucrats to make sure that all goes well. Okay, so they argued that we needed this change from the initial founding, but the American people were very slow to abandon their wariness about unlimited government. I think the progressive victories were solidified by FDR's deft reframing of the question of expanding government in terms that seem to be upholding the founding based on nature rather than repudiating it. And one of the things he does is very, very interesting when he gets to the four freedoms and all of that. He says, you know, that was good for the founders and for that generation. It's probably not adequate for what we need to do. How can we have the equal pursuit of happiness, right? Well, if you ever read that, it says nothing about the equal pursuit of happiness. He just sort of inserts something in there. And that's kind of how it was done, using the same words, but completely changing the meaning of it. Now, I'm going to say that this is a ruse that could not have succeeded without the complicity of the judicial branch, right? Okay. American jurisprudence of the 20th and 21st centuries has time and again drifted from its roots in the common law and Madisonian constitutionalism toward this progressive vision of history. And while the progressives have rhetorically divorced themselves from their Darwinian roots, it can still be recognized for what it is, something deeply and irrevocably hostile to the American Constitution. But after 1937, the Supreme Court adhered to what they considered a new science of jurisprudence that essentially legitimated the arrival of the Leviathan state, right? So all of the limits kind of went away. America now has the oldest written constitution. Its eloquence and venerable old age should be a reason to hold it in high esteem. Instead, as a couple of constitutional scholars have confirmed recently, the U.S. Constitution is increasingly out of step with global trends. An analysis of the 729 constitutions adopted by 188 countries from 1946 to 2006 reveals that since the beginning of the 21st century, there has been a precipitous decline in the use of the American Constitution as precedent. Indeed, the constitutions of the world's democracies are less similar to the U.S. Constitution now than at any time in the past 60 years. So they're writing lots of constitutions, they don't look like ours. And I think that's because, and you may have heard a couple years ago that Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, well, if I were writing a constitution now, I certainly would not use the U.S. Constitution as the model. And she thought that the Constitution of South Africa was a much better effort. And that was what she recommended. Now, it just so happens that more recently, the president of South Africa decided that he would appropriate the land of the white South Afrikaners. And apparently, that constitution that she thought was so good would permit that. So, so the problem is, natural rights do not change with time. And Lincoln said it's the role of great political actors to look backward rather than forward. But progressive theorists, particularly those in the judicial branch, disagree. They say the genius of the Constitution does not rest in any static meaning it might have in a world that is dead and gone. As William Brennan, a well-known proponent of the idea of the living Constitution, explained, he said, the vision of our time is destined to be different from the vision of other times. And the central part of the judicial role is to act as a visionary, asserting that individual dignity is the most important of all political values. Brennan saw the judge's job as articulating its meaning, and this is the key, as that meaning reveals itself in time. Okay? So that meaning will keep shifting. Brennan was noteworthy for his candor, but many members of the judicial branch are equally thoroughgoing historicists. That is why the constitutional interpretation under which the Supreme Court is currently operating is profoundly different from the Founders' Constitution. That interpretation has largely supplanted the original document, and it's much more closely aligned with the sort of constitution making now prevalent in Europe. And both American judges and legal writers have argued that American exceptionalism should be tempered by the introduction of European norms. What they're saying is you should read the Constitution as it would be read in these international venues. So the First Amendment, for instance, would be read as they read it, which is if the speech is offensive, then it's not okay. So the American Revolution represented the culmination of religious consciousness applied to the design of government. The French Revolution heralded the beginning of the secular age. The founders were trying to preserve the permanent rights of creatures made in the image of God, understanding that democracies can err and that an elective despotism is as oppressive as any other. The French Revolution provided the intellectual framework for collectivism, and collectivism sought to answer a different question: how to achieve what Tom Sowell calls cosmic justice. and progressives and liberal theorists call social justice, a world of social and economic equality. Such an ambitious proposal sees no limit to man's capacity to reason. It presupposes a community can consciously design not only improved political, economic, and social systems, but new and improved human beings as well. Until quite recently, liberals, who have now gone back to calling themselves progressives, had still found it necessary to insist that a government entrusted with all the powers of European social democracies would still be gentle and do nothing to reduce civil liberties. The interpretation of a constitution of enumerated powers required courts to apply timeless principles to changing circumstances. A living constitution denies that there is any such thing as timeless principles. Of course, if there are no eternal verities, there are no inherent rights either. And there's a wonderful speech from a Ninth Circuit judge, which is really kind of amazing, but it's from 1944. And he says, if there's no natural law, there are no natural rights. And if there are no natural rights, the Bill of Rights is a delusion. And everything which a man possesses, his life, his liberty, and his property, are held by sufferance of government, and that in that case, it is inevitable that government will someday find it expedient to take away what is held by such a title as that. And if there are no eternal truths, if everything changes, everything, then we may not complain when the standard of citizenship changes from freedom to servility, and when democracy relapses into tyranny. We had, I think, stellar examples of courage and self-sacrifice and restraint in our history. Jefferson credited Washington's moderation and virtue with preventing the American Revolution from becoming what many others had been by subverting liberty. And that was because Washington, when he had the opportunity to declare himself king, declined to do that. As soon as the war was over, he hastened to Philadelphia, put down his commission, put down his sword, and went back to his farm. And by doing that, he actually was praised even by his enemies. King George said that act of just giving everything up when he could have been king placed him in the light he says that he placed him in the light, the most distinguished of any man living, the greatest character of the age. And I think, in some ways it was unfortunate that he was such a strong example, because I have a feeling that the reason that we were so generous with executive powers is that George Washington was going to be the one, who got to exercise those powers, but we didn't get to keep him. So it's become, somewhat more of a problem. But he was unstinting in his patriotism. He had a strict sense of honor, and he had a very realistic assessment of the frailty of human nature. And I think he passed that down to us in our DNA. For there was a very long time when America was America and behaved in very exceptional ways. So what Washington gave us at Bunker Hill and Trenton and Newburgh, we took to Bull Run and Gettysburg, to Normandy, to Okinawa and Iwo Jima, to the Yalu River and Saigon, to the Brandenburg Gate. And he would have been very pleased about that, because he sought very consciously to imprint a national character at the founding that would be the bedrock of what he said would be an honorable and just nation. And for centuries, that seems to have succeeded. But the world is very different now. And so, even in 1987, you had a British prime minister and a pope and an American president who gave a hard shove to the tottering edifice of global communism that ended World War III. We had a president, in the 60s, Kennedy, that's what I'm trying to say, who said, we will bear any burden, go any distance in order to preserve freedom. We had Reagan, who told us that the Berlin Wall would fall because it could not withstand the truth. So we had that history and that DNA, and it must have seemed as if America could never fail. And I felt that way. It's only in the last few years that I've thought, well, perhaps it was more fragile than I thought. So something has gone wrong. I think we all have that feeling. And so the common humanity of identity politics of the civil rights era has been superseded by this virulent common enemy identity politics. The political correctness encouraged by good manners has become a stifling orthodoxy. Speech codes have morphed into full-scale riots where students at elite schools threaten and badger the administrators and the faculty, while claiming physical assaults on unpopular speakers are justified because it is, quote, self-defense. I'm very familiar with Berkeley, which in February 2017 had basically a riot where they smashed ATMs, set fires, hurled rocks and Molotov cocktails at the police, attacked peaceful protesters. And then the next day there was this in the Berkeley paper. It said, if you condemn the actions that shut down this literal hate speech, you condone Milo Yiannopoulos' presence, his actions, and his ideas. You care more about broken windows than broken bodies. I can't impeach Trump. I can only fight tooth and nail for the right to exist. So it's time for those waiting in the center to pick a side. So that's what we're dealing with now. A way of thinking about the world, which is filled with cognitive distortions, right? If you look at what they're saying about, my right, his ideas are a threat to my right to exist. That's literally what they're saying. And if you condemn my violent actions, that means you condone his ideas, right? I mean, look how convoluted this is. There's an idea out there that life is a battle between good people and evil people. And if you don't agree with me, if you don't agree with the flamethrowers, then obviously you're among the evil people. And so that's how this works now. And up until the election of Donald Trump, I had seen several inaugurations, all of which in some way lauded the ability to have a peaceful transition of power. But in 2016, that did not happen. That did not happen. The losers dubbed themselves the resistance, and apparently with no sense of irony, because that was exactly what the White Citizens Council called themselves when Brown v. the Board was decided, by the way, the resistance. So, but they had riots because Trump was elected. They blocked highways, vandalized buses and cars. And then again, here's this justification. One anarchist justified the violence, this is the one that in Portland, to the Oregonian, by explaining that no one should expect, quote, black youth to be peaceful, unquote, when Nazis are going to kill them, right? So it's catastrophizing, hugely exaggerating what's going on. And I won't even comment on the farcical actions of the House of Representatives in this so-called impeachment. So I will just end by saying I think the founders, particularly George Washington, understood that absolutism, even when we can offer a rational justification for its claims, is the enemy of true liberty. Roger Scruton summarizes an essential insight from Adam Smith. He says, when Smith made freedom central to the vision of the modern economy, he was clear that freedom and morality are two sides of the same coin. A free society is a community of responsible beings. It is not a society of people released from all moral constraint, for that is precisely the opposite of a society. In the words of Daniel Mahoney, we are subject to the Tocquevillian conundrum. Liberal democracy needs the wisdom of self-restraint and elevation provided by religion, but it has been the great project of progressive politics as well as modern theology to defend human freedom by limiting the power of God. Just as Victor in the Revolutionary War had required the nation's freedom fighters to summon up the old courage, it is clear when Washington refers repeatedly to divine intervention that he invokes a broad and traditional view of providence. I don't know exactly what the answer is. I wish I had the silver bullet, but I do find that I like Roger Scruton's idea where he says that pessimism has its uses, if in small doses. Just don't get carried away. So what cannot be prevented must be limited. There have always been doubts about the longevity of the democratic republic and the frailty of constitutionalism. But like, T.S. Eliot says, here as hereafter, purgatory is better than hell. So let's get at it.
I don't know if this provides any solace, but when I was a student in the early 1980s, people were catastrophizing the election of Ronald Reagan. Mm-hmm. And I specifically remember some of my fellow students wearing "Shoot Bush First" buttons. So, so while I think we have something that's a worsened degree after 2016, it's been there. One thing that I don't think has been there and is getting worse and worse is the dysfunction in Congress. I specifically think about the failure to pass a budget year in and year out, and just generally operating under any kind of regular order. And I was just wondering if you have a take on that as to, is that a problem and is it something that can be reversed?
Yeah, I think it's a huge problem. The way our government is set up, Congress was really supposed to be the dominant branch and to exercise a lot more control. So one of the things that we have is sort of all of the real law is being defaulted to administrative agencies, essentially, which are very unaccountable. And if you heard Horowitz's report, it's really kind of horrific because these bureaucrats are not. There's the elected officials are able to exercise very little control over them, and they are not unbiased. They are not those neutral, independent experts that the progressives promised us. What happens is they have their own biases and their own vision of how things should be, and it's. In fact, it's always a mistake to think of government as a neutral tool. We always make that mistake. We make that mistake of thinking that we can use it, to accomplish our ends without recognizing that it always has agendas of its own.
How do you feel about the extension of the Supreme Court from its current number of 9 federal, not California, federal, from the 9 justices it is now to a possible 15?
Well, I think that was basically something that was proposed simply because the folks who lost the election felt that they were going to lose control of the Supreme Court. And so it was really interesting because the Supreme Court was the most wonderful institution in the land, and everything they said was the absolute gospel until they realized they weren't going to be able to make the appointments. And then it became an illegitimate institution. Did you notice that? Immediate shift. So but one of the things that's disturbing is how willing people are in trying to pursue their political ends to absolutely undermine the trust in every institution. And just, it's like everything is up for grabs. I mean, there is nothing that people are concerned about protecting anymore, apparently. And that what's being reflected because of that is a very, very low level of trust by people in our institutions.
I'm going to greedily ask the last question before we run out of time. Since I have the microphone, I can do that. One of the things that I've been interested in, and I'd love to get your thoughts on, is the response of states like California to what the Trump administration is doing is to sue. And our Attorney General Harris, then Becerra, they pat themselves on the back for the record number of lawsuits they file. What is your advice to us as, people interested in these conservative public policy ideas and in the grassroots to counteract this sue that's thwarting an agenda the people supported when electing the president?
Well, I don't think that you can stop it. Basically, the judiciary has been weaponized. And so that's just going to be, part of what there is to deal with. There are a number of organizations, that are focusing on different aspects of this. And so, my advice would be find something that you care about and an organization that's fighting on that front, because the people who are focused on it are going to be very good at it. And that's what you want. You want people who are going to be effective in trying to defend these positions. So if you're interested in free speech, there are things like FIRE. If you are interested in religious freedom, there's Back Fund, all those kinds of things. Property, there's several different organizations, that are defending property rights. So that I would say, support them. If you have money, you just want to know where to put it, try to make it count, because on the other side, they are doing that. They're funding those kinds of efforts.
Special thanks to Judge Janice Rogers Brown. If you like this podcast, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you come back again for Next Round with PRI.